Okay, welcome everyone. We're so excited for this launch, this UJ launch, Gauteng Anthropology in partnership with the Department of Anthropology and Development Studies at UJ. I just wanted to take just a minute to share why I wanted to launch this book, particularly in the Department of Anthropology, because there's often a question, why would you host, a book of fiction in an anthropological department? And I want to start with a story of actually one of my students who is here actually in the session. Whilst we were having lunch yesterday, we ended up having one of the most profound conversations with Kuhle about the role of creativity in anthropology. And I've often found that, particularly for students, that they often see that there's a disjuncture between the potential for creativity in anthropology, which can tend to be quite conservative. But in this conversation, we started to speak a lot about, some of the anthropologists we know who are not just anthropologists, but are also creatives, are engaged in music, are writing poetry, and various other kinds of artistic pursuits. I named myself, named Dr. Joy Owen, named Professor Rose Boswell, and many, many others. And on reading 69 Jerusalem Street, I was really touched by how many of the themes are actually some of the topics that we actually grapple with in anthropology. So just from the first story onwards, we are dealing with themes of childhood, themes of disability, the legal system and access to justice. We're dealing with Johannesburg, various facets of the city, poverty, we're dealing with gender and gender ambivalence, and many of these issues that often circulate our class. I think one of the beauties of the book is really not that it makes us see the familiar. So you see Carlton Center in the stories and various other parts of Johannesburg that are familiar, but it also allows us to sometimes see and to be able to relate to some of the things that we often don't understand. And I think that's really the beauty of fiction, that ability to make even the strange familiar. And I think that's what anthropology all the time is trying to do. It's always attracted to things that are a little bit abnormal, and they make those things in some ways familiar to us. And so that's really why, in essence, I wanted to have this conversation. So without wasting any more time, I'll hand over to Welcome. I won't do the introductions because people who come to these events probably know by now that I always prefer that people introduce themselves. I think it's more authentic and humane in that way. So I'm going to switch off my video and go into moderator role. Thank you to everyone who's participating, who's attended. Feel free to drop comments, questions in the comment section, but I know that there will certainly be a question and answer session at the end. So already Shandu has posted in the comment that he has a number of questions for Lindy. So, and hopefully there will be plenty more as the session goes on. So Welcome and Lindy will begin by having a conversation, and then we'll have a question and answer session at the end, just before we close off. So without any further ado, over to you, Welcome and Lindy.
Thank you so much, Dr. Qobani, Qambela, Dr. GQ, for arranging this wonderful talk on this very excellent book by Lindiwe, which I think you have truly outdone yourself. I think Qobani is absolutely right in pointing out how this book has a role to play in anthropological studies. I mean, I think one of the most exciting things for me in terms of how this book fits within anthropological studies are the thick descriptions, so poetic and so simple, yet and so accessible, that Lindiwe uses to give us insight into the characters' lives, in giving us in bringing the characters to life. Lindiwe does such a fantastic job of bringing these spaces, like, when she talks about Jerusalem, 69 Jerusalem Street, when you read about Jerusalem Street and what happens in the township, the area really comes to life with so much color and so much texture. And I'm very excited to be talking to Lindiwe about this book. I think I'll give Lindiwe a chance to introduce herself in a bit. And I'm gonna start with a question to you, Lindy. my simple question to start off is, why the short story? Why that form? There's many forms, of course, that you could have taken in executing this book, but what inspired you to use the short story as a form through which you tell these stories, which will get a bit more into detail? So yeah, tell us how you decided to go for the short story, and just a little bit about yourself for people who don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think the simpler, oh, well, hello everyone and welcome. Thank you for coming. First up to say that. The short story for me is, there's two levels at which the short story works for me. Sorry, my battery is going to die, so I'm just going to plug myself in quickly. There's two levels at which the short story works for me. The short story works for someone who is like myself, for whom writing is not the only occupation that I have, right? So I live another life where I work as an accountant and so on, and I do consultancies and so on. So I have another existence that kind of makes demands on my time, which means that I probably do not have as much of a luxury as someone who lives a life as a full-time writer to weave a novel. I've tried and I'm trying, but the labor that kind of goes into putting together a novel is a labor that is 10 times more than the labor that is required into going into a short story and so on. So expediency would be one of the reasons, not maybe the primary reason, but one of the reasons, in the sense that in a very short space of time, one can actually sit and let a story percolate. It takes me about 6 to 10 weeks or so to kind of weave a short story together when I'm in the thick of it. So I can actually allow myself that time to kind of share my mind space, which has other demands of family, demands of life, demands of work, and so on, with all of these other characters and so on. And I can find a very simple beginning, middle, and ending, and I can focus on the crafting of that, because crafting is quite important for me as well. I can look at the crafting of that within a very short space of time. So from an expediency point of view, the short story kind of becomes a way in which makes sense for me to kind of write. Also,
no, sorry. I think that also, we can go on. I'll add after you add.
Yeah. Also, I mean, it was also the only way that I kind of came into writing as well. I mean, I suppose the second way in which I came into writing. The first way that we all come into writing, those of us who do write, is writing very bad poetry. And then we kind of move on to other things that we find a level of comfort with. So the short story was the second way in which I came into writing, and it became a format that I kind of became familiar with and kind of became comfortable with and kind of stuck with. I do have maybe 2 novels in development, but then this is a story of every writer. Every writer has at least 2 novels in development that they haven't finished yet and so on. So I have those 2. I mean, how soon they kind of get developed into something that goes out into the world is only for time to tell. So expediency and the fact that it's a form of storytelling that I kind of became very familiar with over a period of time.
I think that is so powerful. It's easy. I think it's easy to dismiss that as not dismiss, but look at it as experience here, as just a matter of time. But when we look at the very first story that you write about, and let me take this moment before I go into my question to invite everyone who's listening, who's watching, to write. If you have questions, send them in the comments. We'll definitely take questions if you want to ask them after our conversation. But if you have any questions, please keep your questions, keep them in mind as the conversation is going, or type them in the chat box, and we will ask Lindiwe the questions later. But on the question of time and expediency, I think that is and that is not a new thing in terms of women writers having to get a voice. The idea that one has to take the time to sit down and write, and that the time to sit down and write requires taking time out from, like you said, all the other demands that are made on you by everyday life. And in the short story about titled Rock, you know, like it's a powerful story on so many levels, and it has so many layers. You know, you talk about there's a disabled character, which for me was quite important, because we don't find we don't find such characters told in such humanely ways. So I thought you handled it very sensitively and very well. But there's the character's mom in the story has a guitar that she's struggling to play. There's this guitar that is sitting there waiting for her to play, and she's almost always contemplating when she will play. It's this big conversation in the household as to whether she's gonna play the guitar or not. And
yeah, I saw. Sorry.
yeah, all good.
Can be seen. Sorry.
So I wanted to, you know, when you spoke about time and expediency, I just thought of that character and the idea of creativity, and it made me think of women. Like of course you write a lot about women, but in terms of women finding their creative voice, I mean, in that short story, tell us how you came to prioritize and center the women's voices in your writing.
I want to answer that question in two parts. I want to say that if you talk about women and creativity, I mean, I think a lot of people will be familiar with, if they're not familiar with, that essay that Virginia Woolf wrote about a room of her own, right? So in her room, in a room of her own, Virginia Woolf speaks about what it takes. Essentially, I mean, the crux of that essay is about what it takes for a woman to be able to write. And she's talking about writing in particular, but this extends to other forms of creation as well. She talks about how a woman has to have a room of her own, which kind of implies a sense of independence from anything else. So she's got to have resources of her own. She's got to have the time in order to be able to go up into a room and lock herself in that room and be able to churn out work. She's got to not worry so much about the dishes and the meals and all the other things that kind of preoccupy women's lives and so on. And so, and not a lot of women, and particularly not a lot of Black women, have rooms of their own or the necessary resources to section off time to be able to write. I kind of find that the work of creation, and it's not true in every aspect, but the work of creation is kind of work that is allowed for people who have time for leisure, right? Excess time, if you like. And it's not a commodity that a lot of Black women have, excess time, because we're so busy tending to other people's lives and so on. So that whatever form of expression that one can give in the limited time that you can steal away. For instance, when I'm working, when I'm writing, I kind of have to wake up early in the morning, around 3 o'clock in the morning, before I go to work, and put in about 2-3 hours of writing and so on, and whatever, which elongates my days and so on. So it's something that I kind of have to sneak into my life and find a space to be able to go into this room of my own. This room of my own is not one that is open throughout the day for me to walk in and out of and so on. And I find that this is true of a lot of Black women in particular. And And I think that the subconscious commentary that I was making about Rock's mother in the story about the guitar and whatnot was the fact that she hadn't gotten back to playing the guitar in such a long time, because you don't get it in the short story, but it's kind of like this implicit backstory, right? So much has happened in her life, and you kind of come to it without giving too much away of the story, but you kind of get a sense of it when Dan comes back into her life and they're reunited. There's so much that is left untold and that is implied in the going-ons in her life since the time that she last played the guitar, and the time when the person who actually comes back and picks up the guitar again and kind of reinvigorates that desire in her to kind of play the guitar and for the guitar to become a central part of their lives again. So that sometimes it takes, and this might be me romanticizing things a bit, but sometimes it takes a muse, even if you don't have this unlimited amount of time to go in and out of your room to create, that sometimes the arrival of the muse in whatever form kind of reignites and resparks this ability or this desire to want to go back and create again. And it's something that's it's true of myself. So to the extent that you can see the writer in her own writing, and so on, that to the part that I am displaying aspects of myself that's true of myself, that sometimes it does take that kind of spark in order to be able to revisit that space of creativity, however difficult or whatever the demands are that kind of stand in the way of being able to get to that space of creativity. So yeah. So
and then what was the muse? What was the muse for you?
For me, the muse was, I mean, I say at the back of my book that who and what. So the who have been numerous people, really. But the what, which might be easier to answer, and then I'll answer the who. The what was that I find that I'm constantly battling with the kind of flaming this fire and kind of making sure that it stays alive, right? So the fire to tell stories, or the passion to tell stories, the kind of stories that interest me, the kind of stories that my eye kind of veers towards, and so on, which I think that Gcobani kind of put quite eloquently when he was doing the introduction, which is about the inverse of it is true. He speaks about making the strange familiar, but I'm also interested in making the familiar spectacular. So like you think about daily life in the township and you think, what could there be to possibly tell about township life that could be so gripping and so riveting and so on. And you realize that if you're looking for it, if your eye goes to that space, that you can actually find it, that there is life in, I mean, if we're going to focus on the first story with Rock, that there is life about being a disabled child who sits on a rockmobile and a makeshift wheelchair and whatnot, and that even though your world is kind of circumscribed to your yard or to the perimeters that your rockmobile can take you to, there is no limit to where your imagination can take you to, because she lives quite in her head quite a lot and so on, and her imagination is so vast and so expansive that it will not be limited by this body that cannot move itself between destinations and so on. So the fact that she's not mobile does not limit the world that she's able to access. And she's able to access a quite deep universe. She's able to access a very nuanced universe, a very textured universe, in spite of the fact that she isn't able to move around. So the who of who the muse was, I have made a couple of people's ears bleed over the years. People who were friends, people who were lovers, family, and so on, who were generous enough to actually be able to hear me out. I mean, I think the one person who was most integral in my writing journey was an ex-partner, Dr. Makati Mokwena, who was the first person to have ever asked me a question that no one else in the world had ever asked me. She asked me, if you didn't have to work and money was not a problem, what would you do with the rest of your life? You know, I mean, I came from a family of workers, and work is what we did, you know. So like we went to work, we did work, and this was a preoccupation. It had never occurred to me until the point that she had asked me that there could be like another fantastical world that I could enter into, that didn't require, you know, my surplus labor in the labor market and and so on. And I think that quite instantly I said that I'd much rather be writing, and this was a time when I was still writing bad poetry. And I was like, you know, if I could actually sit down and I didn't have to worry about money and I didn't have to worry about work and so on, telling stories is the thing that I would much rather be doing. So she became my primary muse right at the beginning. And there have been people. I mean, in a room full of people, I'm not the one who is the center of of the conversation, or I'm not the one who's the center
But
of
you are
attention.
now.
I am now, because you've asked me to come and speak. So I can't really do the thing that I do normally. But normally I'm the one who's kind of, I will find someone and I will colonize them, and I will kind of speak to that person for the entire night while I drift in and out of kind of observing things. And I'm not observing because I'm collecting material, but I'm observing because observing people is such a fascinating thing that to kind of take a step back and kind of watch people live their lives and do the things that they do is one of the most intriguing things for me. And so that kind of, I mean, it's not an embodiment of a muse, but it's a thing from which I get inspiration, kind of watching life unfold and so on. So like when I go to Rosebank, people go to Rosebank to go and shop and whatnot. I kind of like to find a spot at a restaurant, pick a corner where I can watch people, and I can just sit there the whole day, have my meal, and just watch people go by and so on. And it's the most riveting thing for me.
I mean, certainly that has yielded into some very excellent prose, and like a well-executed book. Like, you know, when you speaking of the making the familiar spectacular, I want to read this one paragraph from the 69 Jerusalem Street, which I thought was so exquisite. He writes that our Saturdays began always with a breakfast of magwenya, snookfish, wash liver, and acha. Young girls, young girls with towels wrapped around their waists grudgingly swept their mothers' yards, rivaling the whirlwinds with the number of dust storms they raised. Some men left their homes for work, and some for heaven knows where, to return later the same day, for others the same hour the next day, if at all. Women with pegs dangling from their pinafores and their young ones on their backs busied themselves with the week's washing and giving their stoop a shine so bright it could be easily confused for the sun's beam. I think you do such a wonderful job in bringing the familiar, the everyday experiences that we see. You bring them to life with so much color. Like I said earlier, texture and elegant prose. Tell us what goes into the process of you retrieving these images in the telling of the stories or in the formation of a sentence?
Yeah. Well, it's primarily two things, right? I mean, I want to one of my inspirations for writing generally is Toni Morrison, and I think that there isn't anybody of the people that I've read, and so I own it. To my mind, there isn't anybody who is more adept than Toni Morrison at telling the stories of the familiar in ways that kind of put you in the middle of the picture as if you yourself were there, right? So on the one hand. On the other hand, I feel like there isn't anybody also who has mastered the technique of being able to tell those stories in the parlance that they actually take place in. I find that a lot of writers would be great in being able to describe scenarios and develop plot, but they would develop the plot and tell the story in a way that was divorced from the story itself, or from the milieu that the story actually takes place in. And so for me, it's a desire to stay as loyal as possible to the space in which the story kind of takes place, and finding the exact words, the exact sentences, the exact paragraphs that would bring that milieu to life, to the reader. So I first have to kind of believe it. So I kind of almost go into a space where I mentally, I kind of position myself in that space. So I have to see these young women with their towels wrapped around their waists. I have to see them sweeping these dust storms. I have to see the August storm on its own coming. And I have to see the two in battle with each other. Not that I didn't grow up sweeping things myself. So there's an element of it that draws from my own experiences of the township upbringing that I've had. So if not my own experiences, the experiences of my aunts, the experiences of, you know, the people that I grew up around, and so on. And in telling the story, because what I say always is that every time we write, we kind of imagine a reader. I mean, I think those of us who respect the reader, we kind of imagine a reader. We might not have the exact sense of who the reader is, like draw them out like a demographic sketch of who they might be. But there's a sense that at the end of this process that I'm engaged in will be someone who will be reading this. And what I am doing by writing the story down is I'm actually inviting them to forego the spare time that they have to come along with me on this journey that I want to take them down, you know. So in a sense, for having spent that time, 30 minutes of your time, an hour of your time, or whatever it is, I'm kind of hoping that by the time we get to the destination of the short story, in this case together, that you feel kind of rewarded by having gone into the strange worlds that you didn't know of before, and you've kind of sussed out things and picked up things that you now kind of become part of your knowledge scenery, or that you are forced, or your eyes open up to kind of seeing things that you might have been seeing all the time, but that you get to see them in a slightly different way. So I'm hoping that whoever invests in the time of picking up the book and going on the journey with me kind of comes out at the end of the journey slightly different from what they were when they picked up the book. To kind of do that. And some of the ways that I try and do that is to say, to acknowledge that it's not it's a privilege to actually be afforded time to be read, and so on. and so that has to be a rewarding experience. So I kind of tend to want to reward the reader somewhat with if not the entire story itself, with a line, a paragraph, 2 paragraphs, 2 sentences, or whatever, that might linger in their mind for long after they've put the book down. So it's basically just kind of immersing myself in the scene that I'm wanting to write and wanting to describe, but also being very cognizant of the fact that at the end of it is someone who will have to pick it up, and what do they get out of it from having picked it up and so on, and just making it worth their while for having done so.
Well, one certainly gets a lot from having picked up this book. For example, in the opening page of 69 Jerusalem Street, I love how you describe the August whirlwinds, as you write. I was again reminded by the whirlwinds of August 9th, 1997, that August winds, unlike those of other months, always came armed with a purpose, 4 to be exact, shooing children, weaving memories of the streets, clearing the same streets of limping 3-legged dogs with decaying teeth, applying a layer of crimson on the baby nappies lynched in the yet to heat up spring sun, and plummeting women into a swamp of unrelenting pain. August, the majestic month set aside for the celebration of women. And I mean, like that's like when you're talking about things that linger, long after you've read the book. Paging through this, I'm reminded of the excellence of your prose, and how with such a lamentation you are able to bring in the texture and difficulties that women experience. And I wanted to ask you to talk about, right, because this book, as beautiful as the prose is documenting really difficult experiences that women have, had to deal with, like from rape to there's a variety, to mental illness, to disability. You are writing about difficult experiences, and I want you to talk to us a little bit about, writing about difficult experiences and writing about the township, because we all generally, that's the kind of, we expect trauma, so to speak, of the township, but this is handled so well in how you do it. It doesn't cheapen the difficulties that people experience. It puts them to the foreground without being so verbose about it. And I want you to talk to us about writing about difficulties and what that was like in writing about these really difficult themes that the Black community pretty much experiences in the townships.
I mean, life. Let's not be two ways about it. Life in the township is very difficult. Life in the township is hard, and people kind of experience very difficult situations from day to day. So much so that a number of people kind of normalize their existences as what it should be, when in actual fact it really shouldn't be. The township, as we know, was designed not really as spaces that people would call home. And when one says that word home, you kind of imagine ideas of nestling, ideas of comfort, ideas of being welcome, ideas of being welcome, and kind of living a life that is not
soft life.
Yes, a soft life, that kind of thing, nice life problems, those kinds of things. But the township isn't that kind of space. But at the same time that the township is a very difficult place, and that people experience all of these things that you talk about, that I write about, rape, suicide, mental health issues, and whatnot, it is also at the same time not a unidimensional experience, the township, right? The township is, if I draw on my experiences of having grown up in the township, yes, of course, I experienced all those those things that I write about, if not firsthand, but from neighbors or aunts or people that I knew and so on. But I experienced quite a lot of humor as well. I mean, there were sometimes we kind of made fun of these very difficult situations that we found ourselves in, and the sense of community that kind of existed at that time kind of meant that this was a burden that felt like we shared collectively. So no one felt like they had more than their fair share. It's slightly different now, I think. I mean, I think it's a lot more different now. But my memories of the township was that we were all yoked and we were kind of all pulling this mule forward together. And if we found moments that were light, we celebrated those moments. If we found moments that were worth celebrating, we celebrated those moments to the full. And if we found moments that were grief-worthy, we found ways of buffering the gruesomeness we found ways to buffer the gruesomeness so that we could continue existing. Otherwise, it swallows you whole, this entire existence of this sort. It swallows you whole. And I think what I was trying to do with the stories is I was trying to say that here are these lives, and these lives kind of happen against the backdrop of this thing, dare I say, this monster that is the township. But here are these people kind of placed in this stage, if you like, which is the township. And here is how they are actually pulling into their resources, pulling into their camaraderie, pulling into all sense of community and whatnot, and kind of surviving and living in most instances their lives to as full as possible, and not letting these encumbrances kind of get in the way of them having a life. You know, when I talk about Rock, the effect of her immobility kind of doesn't hinder her from experiencing a rich life in and of itself, and so on. So it's basically to say, without glamorizing it, or without valorizing it, or without excusing it, but basically saying that each and every person's life, doesn't matter where it is their place, doesn't matter where it is that their lives kind of play themselves out, has a colorful, layered, dense kind of experience of themselves. And this is what I wanted to portray, the richness and the multi-layeredness of these lives. Because when you read literature written by white people of the township, you kind of get the sense that you were talking about, this woe is me, it's so hard, you know, and you get kind of hit on the head with all of these gruesome things that kind of happen without the texture, the other layers of, oh, but that's not all we are about. You know, we're about other things as well. We're about love, we're about dreams, we're about hope, we're about all of those things. And you don't get that kind of nuance when you read about being written about. And so in part, I just wanted to say, as someone who had grown up in the township, this is what my experience of the township has been like, or this is how I remember the township as having been like, and this is the version of the township that I would actually like to portray.
And it's a very really nuanced indeed version of the township that you portray in your book. And I think it's part of it is the fact, like you say, that you are from the township and this is how you feel about it, this is how you wanted it represented. I think it does have a strong sense of insider, of someone who's an insider, largely because of, like I said earlier, how rich the descriptions feel and how familiar the book reads. But I want to ask, what's your advice then to, because we have a lot of people writing about the township, you know, many of whom are not from the township, and there's many versions going on about what is the township and what happens in the township. And I want to ask you what your advice is to people who want to or are writing about the township. What do you have to say to them?
I think, I
Who
mean,
may not
and
be from them.
yeah, it's the thing that I was saying earlier, that I'm going to make an example, backtrack a little bit. James Coetzee wrote that book, Disgrace, right? And in Disgrace, the women were represented poorly, so much so that I think of the stories that I know, at least two people have written back to Disgrace, to kind of offer an alternative narrative. I forget the second one, but the first one that I can think of off the top of my head is Fiona Snickers's Lacuna, when she writes from the perspective of Lucy and kind of is speaking back to James Coetzee in very detailed ways, kind of marking out the things that he got wrong in Disgrace. I remember when I was doing my English studies, that Disgrace was actually set as a set work, and remembering that there were about four black men in the book. Well, okay, there were the 6 black men who do the raping, and then there were like 3 other black men who were written about quite prominently, and they have full lives and whatnot. There was only one black woman in Disgrace, and all she does in Disgrace, the black woman whose name I don't even remember, I don't know if she was named even, I think she was named as Petros's wife, she didn't even have a name of her own, is that she comes out and she points at something. Someone asks her a question and she points, and that's the full extent of what we have, the interaction with this black woman. It's like, so black women are people, she was hanging laundry or something and then she points at something. So black women are these people who kind of hang laundry and point, have no life of their own, have no thoughts of their own, have no interior worlds of their own, have no emotions of their own. And this is how we appear in literature that is not written by ourselves, purely because there's no ways that James Coetzee, as a white male, could inhabit the world of a black woman and be able to say that in her pointing, maybe that's all she does, maybe she points, but maybe at the time that she's pointing, she's thinking about something. We don't have a sense of that, and so on. So basically, to answer your question, I'm trying to say that it's important for people who are writing the township to kind of say, this is what I know about the township, or these are my preconceived ideas about the township, or this is what I think I know about the township, but dig a little deeper and say, but is that what the township is all about? You know, is it just about gender-based violence? Is it just about rape? Is it just about the surface level things that I kind of see? Is it possible that just like myself, just like anybody else, that these lives are deeper, more nuanced, more richer, and that they have layers just like anybody else's life? So to guard against kind of taking the surface understanding or the surface knowledge of what one thinks they know about the township, and kind of running with that as a way of telling what might be seen as the authentically township story, but to kind of also take into cognizance the fact that there's there's a there's a there's a richness in each individual person's life in the township as much as they exist when you pick up a book from anywhere else, and so on. So guard against writing the surface level narrative of what the space of the township has been known or popularized as being.
I think that's so good. And I mean, I spoke a lot earlier about, you know, the difficulties and the multiple themes that run through the book. And I think one of them is one of the most prominent, whether it's spoken or unspoken in a lot of the stories, is the idea of mental health, mental well-being, mental illness, and how, you know, Black people in the townships are pretty much responding to, and coping with that. And I thought that theme was so prominent that it almost became a commentary, so to speak, of sorts on how the Black communities is thinking through and responding to mental illness, because we know that there isn't a culture of talking about mental illness and recognizing the various forms that it takes. And can you tell us what your view is on that, on how, you know, you think that Black community is currently responding to or dealing with the current mental health, mental illness pandemic that's taking place at the moment?
I think it's gotten better over the years, because now I suppose people can name things, right? You can say, I have depression, although I mean, I think if you say I have depression, you go to your mother in the township and you say I suffer from depression, they'd be like, how or whatnot, like, you know, why are you depressed? Why would you be depressed and so on when you have everything else? And I think that because the dailiness of life, or the amount of energy that is exerted towards kind of taking care of the basic needs of survival, kind of supersede almost everything, that it becomes very difficult to go into in ways that are articulable, to go into ways of expressing. A lot of people in the township are going through an existential angst, you know. It's as I said before, it's not a place that was designed to be friendly and habitable kind of space. And if you already take a space, spatial design, only a couple of places now only getting electricity after 1994 and so on, just the way that spatial design was handled, the way that the setting up of amenities was designed. I think I went to the only school in the township that I had a tennis court and so on, and there were basketball courts and so on. So people kind of spend an inordinate amount of their time worrying about the day-to-day, like, you know, will I have enough money to eat? Will I have enough money to clothe myself? Will I have enough money to pay the rent and so on? That to pay particular attention to the health of their mental state is something that becomes secondary. But it doesn't mean to say that people do not actually go through these kinds of sufferings of mental health and so on, so that people think about it. I mean, I don't know what the statistics look like, but there are quite a lot of suicides that happen in the township, particularly now with the exams. The exams kind of bring out a kind of neurosis in the country in general, as far as they relate to Black people, matric exams in particular. You will find those stories of I mean, I was saying in another conversation with someone, and I hadn't seen the story as yet, and then true to form, 2 of those stories came out. Stories of the kids who studied under candlelight, and they didn't have candles, and they had 2 candles that they had to switch off between 4 and 2 in the morning and whatnot, and they still managed to get 7 distinctions. So on the one hand, you get that, and then on the other hand, you get the child who doesn't pass matric, and the family says, wow, you know, if that other child can do it, why couldn't you do it? Which is an unfair and an unreasonable comparison that kind of puts immense stress on kids. And immediately after the matric results are issued, the number of suicides kind of spikes in the township, because people are like, my family was counting on me. A lot of people would have been the first person to go to university for them and whatnot. And so much is riding on that the pressure kind of the unspoken pressure that they've been carrying for such a long time, that had been chipping away at their mental health, finally kind of becomes the straw that breaks the camel's back, and they resort to suicide. I remember growing up that there were quite a number of people who I didn't understand. I mean, there were characters in the streets. There was a man 2 houses from us who we used to call him Malum Tutu. He used to live in the garage of his sister's garage and so on, and never interacted with anyone. The only time that you would see him is when he was sent to the shops to go buy bread and supplies and so on, and then he'd go back to his room immediately and just kind of sit and giggle the whole day. I mean, I wondered what was wrong with that. Obviously, I mean, as kids, we thought that was the funniest thing ever, that this man kind of sits in this room and kind of giggles the whole day. Much later, when I was kind of grappling with issues of mental health myself, I was like, no, man, this man must have suffered some form of mental health that was unspoken about, that we didn't understand, that we were never kind of brought in to understand at all. So there's quite a lot of people in the township who live these lives where they are misunderstood and so on, that if you were to take the time to go and sit with them and kind of explore their interior world, you would find that they are grappling with existential crisis, and that they're grappling with untold mental health issues that maybe even they themselves are not able to express and articulate and kind of take as something that is part of their lives and so on. So now that people are able to name things, I find that it's becoming slightly easier. And now that more Black people are kind of coming out and saying, I live with a mental health issue, I live with a mental health problem, and so on, the stigma that is attached to that. So it's not now relegated only to the realm of Batbasanyang, or like, or the people who are mad, or people who are not part of the society and so on, that it can have a face of a regular person. I mean, like if I say I live with bipolar, no one is going to say that I am mad or crazy or whatnot, because I continue with my life and I continue to kind of continue with my life and so on. But to say that it is fully understood, it will take a long period of time. But I feel like we have made, or that we are making strides. It's baby steps, but we are making strides from back in the day when there were people like Malum Tutu who were not understood at all, to a place where people are kind of coming out and saying, well, I live with depression, I live with bipolar, I live with anxiety, and so on. So that kind of conversation is beginning to happen, and I hope that it continues to happen, so that we don't lose as many people as we have without explanation to ourselves, or without having honored them enough to have taken the time to understand them.
I'm going to start opening up questions to everyone. So if there are people who would like their questions, please get ready. Raise your hand or something, and you'll be noted, or put it in the comment section if you want me to ask it for you. But how do we write about Black life, Black lived experiences, with all the difficulties that you capture and the stories that you write about in here? How do we write about Black life in such a way that we begin not the healing process? I know that sounds so rah-rah, woo-woo, but how do we write in a way that heals the Black community? Because there is so much trauma that we're carrying, and one doesn't need to look further than the news to know that. How do we write back in ways that ensure a healing process begins for Black people?
I think that what we do is we take ourselves as we are, like, right, and we begin to have like honest conversations with each other. I mean, I think that the level of I was reading it was in the form of a meme, but it was a quotation by Einstein, I think, and I'm paraphrasing very badly, but it was something about, if you take a fish out of water and you kind of push it to kind of learn how to climb a tree, and it fails all the time, over time it's going to begin to think that there's something wrong with it, right? There's nothing wrong with the fish itself. It's the circumstances that it's been put into that are kind of making it feel like it's facing insurmountable odds and so on. So if we take a moment, and this also sounds a bit rara, but if we take a moment and kind of connect with ourselves and connect with who we really are, the essence of who we really are, and so on, and we'll look at ourselves, warts and all, and we kind of have very honest discussions about what we do well, what we don't do too well, and so basically almost like going to therapy for the entire nation, in a sense, right? Like an introspective kind of situation where we can then heighten within amongst ourselves the things that we're really good at, and not just the regular things that people think that we should be good at, like music and sports and those kinds of things, although those things are important too. But kind of our thinking, remembering that we contribute to thought as well, kind of reminding each other what thoughts it is that we are responsible for, kind of reminding each other. I'm thinking again of a Thandiswa Mazwai song, that kind of thing. So like, if we go back to the source somehow and we kind of remember, and I'm not saying this in any hotepi kind of way that we were kings and queens and we can go back to that kind of space and rule again and whatnot, not in that kind of way, but to in a sense to kind of get to the essence and the core of who we are, which I think that is the thing where apartheid and colonialism kind of succeeded really at doing us in, kind of chipping away at the fiber of who we are. So we have this big garment that is supposed to be the fiber of who we are, but it's filled with holes, and so we kind of need to embark on a national, if you like, on a national project as the Black community to kind of mend that. And once it's mended, or while the work to mend it is in progress, we will not necessarily get restoration to back to what we were before, and what before was sadly is something that we remember differently, and maybe we need to kind of have a sense of remembering that with not pink tainted sunglasses and so on, but like a more realistic remembering of who it is we are, but that we can begin this mending process, and that work of mending can become as much of the story that we tell ourselves as much as it becomes the story that we tell future generations that come after us. But we kind of have to be committed to a project of sorts that recognizes that there was a system, that we are a damaged people, and that we're damaged not because we are a fish that can't climb a tree, but we're damaged because there was a systematic project put into place kind of damage us. And so we need to kind of mend ourselves and mend each other as a community, so that we'll begin to tell new stories about where it is we're going, and tell more realistic stories about where it is we come from.
I love that so much.
Mm-hmm.
There's a comment from D saying it's very refreshing to hear a writer owning the fact that this is not their primary activity, even though it may be of primary importance to them. And they go on to say there are several guitar images in the book, and that makes me wonder what Lindiwe's relationship might be with guitars. It strikes me as rather complex. I would be interested to hear her speak a little bit more about her writerly understanding of the guitar image, or the guitar imagery. Tell us about you and the guitar.
Me and the guitar is a very long story that doesn't end very well, actually. I made my own guitar, my first guitar, when I was about.
You made it.
Yes, I made it. I made my first guitar when I was about, maybe I was 7, maybe 7, 8.
Oh wow!
You would have seen this. You would have seen this in stories, somewhat. It wasn't really difficult to do. You just needed to ransack your mother's house and get into trouble for doing it. But they used to sell 5-liter. We called it fish oil, cooking oil, whatever.
Oh yeah,
in
those white scoopers.
Those white tin scoopers, right? You
Yes.
get the white scoop tin.
Oh, the tin ones, I see.
Yes. And then you get a plank of sorts, and then you get curtain railings for strings, and then you get nails and so on. I made that thing, and I used to make such a racket with that thing that I think it irritated my father into buying me my first actual guitar, actually. So
that does end well, somewhat.
Yes, it does. Well, it doesn't. Well, I mean, I should be able to regale people with guitar music, but I'm sad to say that I can play like 2 songs very well, and then I can strum and so on. So I've had an on and off relationship.
Next time we can open with a song.
Ah!
One of the 2 songs.
Yes, we could do that.
But what is it? What is it with guitars? Why the guitar? Even in the first place, when you first made it, what propelled you? What drew you to the guitar?
To be perfectly honest, I don't know. I mean, I think it was a curiosity. We didn't have a TV then, so I wouldn't say that I saw them on TV or anything. I really don't have an honest answer to that, other than the fact that I was drawn to them. And I suppose
you continue to be.
Sorry?
You continue to be drawn to them.
I continue to be drawn to them. I have a guitar in the house as we speak. I mean, I do have a guitar of my own. So like ever since my father bought me a guitar, I've never kind of lived a life without a guitar, whether or not I was playing it. Ever so often I will strum and so on. It's soothing, and I don't know, it kind of takes me to a place I can't describe, and so it's almost like I think this person is correct. It's almost like a mythical relationship that I have with the guitar, the sources of which are probably too subconscious for me to be able to articulate properly, but just something that I'm drawn to.
Do you have? I don't know if anyone wants to ask a question.
Shandu had.
I don't know.
Shandu had said that she has questions.
Okay, Shandu.
Feel free to unmute yourself.
Yeah, Shandu is muted.
Shandu is reconnecting. I don't know what happened.
Yeah, but you know, reading, for example, as we wait for Shandu to come through, like reading in the reading so many stories, like the actual 69 Jerusalem Street, like the way you talk about the gossip, how the women are gossiping as they bake the scones was just so delicious, so to speak, because you had to be there. I know those moments when you know the women in my life are baking and there was conversation going on and everyone was holding on to each other for every bit of that tea that was being spilled. Do we have Shandu back? Still muted. Yes, I think you should be fine now, Shandu.
Oh yeah, you.
Go for it. Still muted. I think you're having the same challenges I was having, Boo. I'm saying Shandu who's trying to. So we understand.
Okay, I think I was unmuted. D, are you there? Okay, Shandu is there. You are unmuted now because it moves to your screen.
Kuhle, I need this book ASAP. I agree.
Yeah.
Get yourself this book ASAP. It is so good. Like it's delicious to read. It's informative. It really does give you the lived experiences of the people that Lindiwe writes about. I would definitely encourage that you get it. Shandu. Okay. So maybe just send the questions in the chat box because we are struggling to hear people. Shandu also had a comment saying Fiona did a great job in her response to disgrace. And
can you just give Shandu a chance? So Shandu, try one more time unmuting yourself and then speaking. Okay, so the screen does move to your side, which means it can tell you are speaking, but I think there's a problem.
Unmute.
No, he's definitely unmuted because it moves the screen to him, so which means it can read him talking. But I'm not sure what device you are on because the sound is not transmuting outside. Okay, Shandu, now you should be speaking. Shandu.
Technology.
Okay. While Shandu is getting sorted, D, can you try unmute yourself? So you were trying to speak.
Yeah, Shandu says he will type the question. Let's hear from D now.
Okay. D, I've made you the moderator, so you should have all the powers as us.
As we wait, Lindy, so I can get some more. I mean, you already spoke on this in one way or another. But what's your advice to young budding writers, anyone who's currently working, including myself, working on a book project, working on a writing project, or wants to write? What's your advice?
I think one of the most important thing is to remember that there is always time. I mean, I spoke earlier about how there isn't time, but there is always time if you make it. So to kind of think of writing as anything else in your life. If you said that you didn't have time to sleep, for instance, you'd be walking around a total nightmare, right? So whatever else is happening in your life, you do make time to sleep. So to kind of jealously find make the time, if time is a consideration, make the time to section off to your writing. Also, and this is easier said than done, but to write regularly, you know. There's these writer jokes about how one person took a 5-minute break to have a coffee, and 5 years later they still haven't gotten back to their manuscript. I mean, there are those kinds of jokes, which are kind of real things, you know, which are kind of things that happen. So limit those 5-minute breaks to 6 minutes if you must reward yourself with a little bit of extra time. But kind of, I mean, I think that the greatest writing advice I ever got was just show up. I mean, even if that showing up means you're basically writing 2 pages, 500 words, 1,000 words, 800 words, 400 words, whatever. Just keep at it, because all of those small gains cumulatively become your project in the end. So it's not the wisest or the greatest to kind of sit and wait for a bout of inspiration so that you can consume yourself in the process of writing, but just kind of take joy and pride in the cumulative gains that you make on a regular basis, on as regular basis as possible. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Tulani raised the question. Go for it.
Oh, hi guys.
Raise their
Thanks for
hand.
the opportunity.
We can hear you, Tulani, perfectly.
Sure. Okay. So I'd like to know your advice, to get your advice on the upcoming writers in terms of class, right? We know that there's difference where, as much as I read, there's difference between a black writer and a white writer, and with blacks being so engraved in the conservative society where we are sort of we are socialized to not to write about black experiences because of fear of exposure, you know. So what could be your advice in terms of class in those regards? I don't know if I'm clear. My question is clear, not. But ultimately, you've mentioned time, resources, domestic work in terms of women having the voice, but on a general sense, including male writers, what could be your advice in terms of class? Like, yeah.
Thank you.
And I don't mean to reframe your question differently, and if I'm reframing it differently, you can let me know. But I'm hearing you say 2 things, right? I'm hearing you say that there's a level of inhibition. This is the second thing you say, a level of inhibition on the side of black writers to write because of shame of writing, of exposing things in the black community. I suppose I'm hearing you say on the one hand, but then you're also saying class differences and the ability to write that extend beyond just women's inability to write. Am I hearing you correctly? Tulani? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and assume that that's what
I do think that was a major chunk of what he was getting at, but you know, Tulani, feel free to get back on and confirm that. But I say go ahead with that.
Yeah. I mean, I think that writing. I'm gonna straight up say it. Writing is an elitist thing, right? People who can write are people who have excess time. So, I mean, it already puts you in a slightly different class, the ability to write. Not a lot of working class people have time to be able to write. So you kind of have to be middle class, and you kind of have to have excess time in order to be able to write, even if it means that you're making the extra time. The extra time is coming from things that you're not having to worry about. If women have to worry about dishes and laundry and whatnot, this is something that I'm not going to say in the Black community, because this is overall, really. I mean, it's also in the white community. This is something that men don't necessarily have to worry about. So there's already that time to be able to do that. It was maybe not elitist. Maybe it's a thing of privilege, having the privilege to have excess time to do that. So it does create these class dynamics. A lot of white writers don't have to worry about these things so much, and a lot of white writers are privileged enough to be able to make writing their main preoccupation, and they can spend as much time as possible writing. So yeah, class is a factor in the ability to write. But I think that the thing that I was saying to Welcome about if the desire to tell stories, and this is going to link in quite nicely with the second part of your question, but if the desire to tell the kinds of stories that you want to tell burns so much within you, it becomes something that you kind of want to jealously guard and make time for, in the same way that I was saying, you do make time to sleep, you do make time to eat and whatnot. And if you really, really want to tell stories, there should be a way in which you should be able to make time to do this. And I buttress that on the fact that I'm saying that a lot of times one has to come from a position of a level of privilege, however much that privilege is, and we can kind of measure that privilege, and it has to do mostly with the kind of with how compelling the story is that you're wanting to tell. You know, like how desperately do you want to tell that story, and if there's like a level of urgency in the telling of that story, then it's something that you will make time for. I mean, I certainly don't think that one will be motivated enough to tell stories if the stories that you're telling are something that you're ashamed of. I think that we need to move away from that element of shame. There isn't, I don't think, anything so shameworthy that we cannot write about it. If we, in the discussion that I was having with Welcome earlier, we were saying the township is a very difficult place to live in, and it might not be the township in your case, it might be whatever thing that kind of feels like is a burden or a noose around your neck that is burdensome, or that might be cause for shame, that looked at from many different angles, there isn't a way in which, if the story is compelling enough, that you cannot tell it in a way that doesn't shine the spotlight on just the shame. And if you're ashamed of the story that you want to tell, you probably won't do it any justice. You kind of have to look at it from a perspective that says, what is so compelling about the story that I want to tell it? And remember at all times that it's never a unidimensional approach to a story, that it's always multifaceted. Don't know if that helps.
Yeah, I think that helps a lot. And I mean, to also add, I'm gonna take multiple questions because we have about 15 minutes. I wanted to also add to that, like what you do with the book is you sit with the difficulties, with the uncomfortable stuff, and you sit with it as is, and that's how we have this book. You know, it's not, you're not trying to sugarcoat it so much as you are trying to be a vessel for these stories, and I thought that was quite powerful. There was a hand raised here by Kagiso, who concurs with everything on the privilege, on what you're saying about the privilege. So Shandu, I'm gonna assume that you are back online now and can speak. And right after Shandu, KG, Kagiso, please ask your question as well, and you can address both questions together. I'm gonna start with Shandu and then Kagiso. Go for it. Shandu? Okay, there's in the interest of Shandu, there's let's hear from KG. What's your question, KG? I'll read Nzamo's question as well, and you can reply
Hi.
to everything.
Hi.
Yeah.
And I thought Mzamo's question is very interesting, actually, and I really wanted to hear. And mine is more of a comment than like a question, in which how our circumstances, and I think that's never really taken into consideration. Right? Really informs the process, or the mode, in which we often tell our stories. So I love that bit when Lindiwe said that, in it that she works multiple jobs. I'm like, she can't be fully invested in, in the process, of writing, for example, a fully fledged novel and all those things. So I'm more than anything as an anthropologist, especially now, I'm always interested in process, in what's sort of like, in other sort of disciplines, they will call it limitations at the end of let's say a dissertation. What were my limitations and stuff, right? So, but I think it's really, really fair to always take that into consideration that, there are a lot of limitations, but more than anything, the way you choose to tell your story is not any less valid, than other modes of sort of like telling your story. So I really love that sort of like, vignette. And thank you so much. I now also want to go buy a book and read it. Thank you so much, guys. That's
Do
about it.
yourself a favor and get on it.
Thank you, Tilani.
Mzamo's question is, what is your opinion of the political implications of using the English language as the core medium of expression in the moment of recapturing or reconstructing identity from a historical African perspective?
Yeah, that's a big question. So let's
And
address
then
it second.
another question
Shandu.
is the second question from Shandu, and we're gonna unfortunately leave it off here. Lindy, was the process of writing the book cathartic, given that you write about the ordinariness of Black life? So there's two questions there in KG's comment.
Yeah. I think. Well, let me address Shandu first. It was definitely cathartic. I mean, I find that writing is cathartic for me, because of the subjects that I write about. Yes, the ordinariness of Black life and so on. But I also find it cathartic at another level, that and precisely why I kind of gravitate towards the writing of short stories and so on, that I feel, mind you, I've never been pregnant in real life, so people who've been pregnant for real can tell me. So I feel like I'm carrying this world inside of me, and I create this world and I, color it and whatnot, and it stays with me for such a very long period of time, or for, 10 weeks, 6 weeks, whatever it is. And when I finally bring it to fruition, it feels like, whew, I can relieve myself of that particular world and go and enter into another world. It's almost also very slightly neurotic, because I work as an accountant. When I work as an accountant, and so I'm kind of balancing numbers on the one end of my brain, and I'm thinking, is it balancing, is it doing what it needs to do, at the same time as I'm kind of contending with what this character is telling me they're going to do next and so on. And I can't wait to go home and kind of put that to pen to paper and move the story in the direction that it kind of moves on. So for the period of time that I am incubating a story actively, it becomes, as I say, people never having been pregnant in real life in the physical sense, it feels like I'm about to give birth to something. And the sooner I have given birth to it, the sooner it feels, the more relief I kind of feel. I mean, it's painful in the sense that I miss going into that world and so on, but I feel a sense of catharsis for having put something to rest, or for having created this world and kind of brought it to fruition. So on both levels, it's cathartic for me. Umzamo. That's a very complicated question. I mean, I often catch myself when they say, when you have to fill in forms, right? And they ask you what your home language is. It's probably one of the most difficult questions for me. I'm like,
All right.
Yeah, like,
what do we speak at home?
Yeah. And we speak 3 languages in my house, we speak 3 languages interchangeably. That's what we do. We speak Sesotho, we speak isiZulu, and we speak English as well. So what is it? Is it the thing that I am ethnically, or is it the thing that I best communicate myself? Is it the language that I communicate best in, or that I can articulate myself in the most? And for many reasons, and they're sad and not sad. I mean, the English is like, we speak 11 official languages in South Africa, but English is the main medium of communication. I'm having a conversation. I mean, I don't know how many ethnic groups are in the room, but Gcobani is Xhosa. Him and I can kind of understand each other when we speak, because isiZulu is so close to Xhosa. But if Welcome and I were having this conversation, and we were having it in our mother languages, it would make it slightly difficult to be able to conduct the conversation for people listening as well. So problematic as it is, as I mean, historically and so on, English, it's become this adopted way that we can communicate across many dimensions and actually be able to understand each other. And it's also expedient to the extent that if I had written this book, unless I'd written it in isiZulu and gotten it translated, that I would have a limited reach of people that would actually be able to access it. And it's it's a numbers game, really. I mean, I would have limited reach of people who would be able to access the book and be able to read it and understand it. And so English then becomes that vehicle through which I suppose I filter, as you say, those childhood memories and so on, and reconstruct them as best as possible. I mean, I'm certain, I know this for a fact. At the point where I'm writing from the vantage of a child and I'm drawing from my own experiences, those experiences didn't happen in English. They certainly didn't happen in English. But there's nothing that says, in the realm of the creative or in the realm of the reconstruction of those moments, that I could not take them and tame them into this language that kind of is I'm loath to say is a unifier, but is one that kind of builds bridges so that people can understand each other across different barriers and so on. Don't know if that answers it.
I think it does, and I like that you use the word taming, to kind of tame the language, because I think some of the great writers from from Tony, for example, have shown us, like some of the great Black writers have shown us, that you can tame the language and use it as a tool for self-expression and to express yourself the way you do. Because the way you write here, yes, it's English, but it's so black and it's so hood in ways that if it had been someone else writing about this, it wouldn't have the texture and feel of the places that you write about. So I do think you do a great job of taking the language to make it a tool for you and not the other way around.
Yeah.
I'm going to hand over to Gcobani. I want to thank you so much for this wonderful conversation, for your wonderful contribution with this excellent book, and for being persistent enough to see it through. In her book, The Remembered Rapture, The Writer at Work, Bell Hooks talks about how there's this line that I love where she says, "This precious, powerful sense of writing as a healing place where our souls can speak and unfold has been crucial to women's development of a counter-hegemonic experience of creativity within patriarchal culture." And I think with all the creative input you have put into this and writing these stories, you really have in many ways created or contributed towards a counter-hegemonic experience of creativity within patriarchal culture. And for that, I thank you immensely. Over to Gcobani.
Thank you so much.
No pressure. How do I top Bell Hooks, Toni Morrison, and then what else is there for me to say? No, I think three key takeaways for me. It actually was going to be my questions, but I'm going to turn them into closing comments because I realize we're out of time. And I think the first one is really the first thing that people often forget is that really anthropology for us is storytelling. And I really loved that moment of you saying, you know, Rosebank is more than just Rosebank for you, but it's a part of almost your own ethnography of really observing and really almost taking in the stories of what people do at the most mundane of moments. So I really appreciated that because I think it's a skill that students often forget. And then the other thing I loved in the book, and you hinted at this early on in the talk, was the subtle humor. And I think even from the first line in the book, I was like, what is going on, rock and roll? And then it took me a while. I was realizing, oh, it's a wheelchair. But I really loved, and I made a note here that I think, but it's not humor that dehumanizes for me. It was humor that actually brings back to humanity, that really almost not gives back the agency, but already, you know, shows us the ways in which people, even in the most deprived of conditions, still practice various forms of agency. And then really the last one was really the tension for me between sort of ethnography and fiction, which is also another big conversation in anthropology throughout the stories. And you probably can see, I literally read it like I read a textbook, so there are notes. And it's always me thinking through other things in reality and so on. So it's really a beautiful book. And we really thank you for it. I saw some of my students here. We will be buying them copies because I really think it's so useful, not just in terms of the actual content of which the stories are beautiful, but also how to really write people back into humanity. So it's been an absolute pleasure in the past 2 hours at Gauteng Anthropology to have you here, and we hope, you know, someday, hopefully in the near future, we can have a proper book launch for you in person. I think these conversations are so richer. So thank you both, and to welcome as well for the wonderful conversation and facilitation. So thank you, people.
Thank you. Thank you.